We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
White House finalizes theft of Afghanistan's foreign reserves. The government of Biden has decided not to return Afghanistan's foreign reserves and suspended talks with Taliban officials over the issue. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Quote, we do not see recapitalization of the Afghan central bank as a near-term option, U.S. Special Representative Thomas West told the Wall Street Journal. Exactly 1 year after the Taliban took control of Kabul, quote, we do not have confidence that that institution has the safeguards and monitoring in place to manage assets responsibly, end quote. Dr. Horne, that's the bank robbers saying, I'm not going to send the money back to the bank because I can't trust their security system.
Well, there is a very delicate dance unfolding between U.S. imperialism and the Taliban in Afghanistan. You get a glimpse of that by looking carefully at an article in the New York Times just today, this morning, speaking of August 22nd, 2022. If you look at that article carefully, it's apparent that Washington feels it can do a deal with the Taliban against the interests of the People's Republic of China by having the Taliban influence dissident Muslims in the west of China, for example, the Uyghurs, of which you have heard so much of late, who Washington and others charged Beijing with perpetrating genocide against them. So I take it that what is now happening is that Washington is dangling Afghan money before the Taliban. And if the Taliban goes along with U.S. imperialist policy, then they'll dress up somehow, turning over these funds to the Taliban. Perhaps there'll be some concessions on girls' education, or perhaps there'll be the appearance of some concession on girls' education. And then what you need to look for next is Afghanistan being used as a point of destabilization against Western China. I should also say that this theft that you have made reference to is wholly consistent with what's happening with regard to imperialist policy. You know, I'm sure, that after February 24th, 2022, the United States put the clamps on Russian funds to the tune, if I recall correctly, about $300 billion. We know that London has the clamps on like amounts from Venezuela that they have refused to relinquish because they claim that the Maduro regime is not the legitimate authorities. But back to Afghanistan, I think it's important for your listeners to understand the torturous history of relations between the United States and Afghanistan, because I think it's quite illustrative of the failing of U.S. foreign policy. If you go back to the early 1970s, Afghanistan was not this ultra-religious citadel that you see today. It was a country on the path to a certain kind of socialism. In fact, it had a left-wing government.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the left-wing government in Kabul had two wings. And then, of course, that was grist for the mill, manna from heaven for U.S. imperialism, as they sought to manipulate one wing against another. And then, as the situation was deteriorating, in December of 1979, the successful wing of the People's Democratic Party invited in the Soviet Union to help cease a religious insurgency sponsored by U.S. imperialism. You may recall, if you go back and look at the Rambo movies, there was a Rambo movie with Sylvester Stallone that featured prominently a glorification of an Osama bin Laden type character. And so this was evidentiary of this budding alliance between religious zealotry against the left in Afghanistan, and that succeeded. You know that the last left-wing leader of Afghanistan, Najibullah, was not only lynched, he was castrated, Negro style, in Kabul, Afghanistan. And since that time, of course, there has been unrest. We know about the allegations about the Taliban housing Osama bin Laden and his Confederates when they were said to have engineered the attack on New York and Washington in September 11, 2001. And so, having said all of that, it would not be surprising that with regard to this torturous relationship between religious zealotry and Washington, that it might be due for another turn. That is to say, the same kind of collaboration that we saw in the 1980s, but this time in the 21st century against the People's Republic of China and perhaps even Russia as well.
I really wanted to get your thoughts on this. Tehran, almost 7 decades have passed since the U.S. orchestrated coup toppled Iran's then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. On the occasion of the anniversary of the U.S.-led coup in Iran, Ali Bahadouri Jarami, the spokesman for the Iranian government, said Friday that, quote, putting trust in the United States in international ties is meaningless, citing it as one of the 3 lessons for Iran from the 1953 coup d'etat. Your thoughts on, that incident and how it affects geopolitical realities today?
Well, I think also in terms of putting trust in U.S. imperialism, the Iranian authorities are drawing an appropriate lesson from the bolting from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with regard to the negotiations between Iran and the United States and the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany with regard, as noted, to the nuclear accord, which Mr. Trump bolted from. And now the Biden administration is trying to knit it back together. But there's no guarantee that if Mr. Trump returns to power in 2025, he may bolt again. And so it's understandable why the Iranian authorities are not going to buy that horse twice. But I also should say, with regard to Iran, that it also carries a lesson similar to that of Afghanistan. And once again, to continue the theme of the day, it goes back to this maniacal obsession with trying to stem the redistribution of the wealth, a policy that went under the name of anti-communism, a policy that certainly had the Soviet Union in its crosshairs, but also recall that in the run-up to the Iranian Revolution circa 1979, that Washington was collaborating with the religious authorities in Tehran against the interests of a left-wing party, the Tudor Party, because it was thought that they were too militant concerning the redistribution of wealth. And so, to a certain degree, when the Tudor Party was weakened, if not driven mostly into exile, or certainly driven below ground, Washington, in a sense, got the result that it had plotted for, the rise to power of religious authorities, who now they have a bone to pick with, but I'm not sure if Washington has a way out with regard to these particular rulers, although we know that they have been sponsoring, that is to say, U.S. imperialism, various terrorist attacks on Tehran from around neighboring countries. And perhaps the ultimate option that Washington will pursue in Iran might be the option that the right wing is planning here in North America, which is utter chaos.
I just want to put a bow around your discussion about the United States and the Taliban and going back. I just want to ask this question again to put the bow on it. The United States has done this before. I think it was the United States dealing with the Mujahideen as the United States was trying to leverage or fight Russia in Afghanistan. The United States tried this whole game with the Mujahideen, and it did not work. And so this is basically deja vu all over again. Am I right there? And then the other point is, if you could elaborate on Pakistan's ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan gets protective bail in a Pakistani terrorism case.
Well, certainly with regard to the first point, when I was making reference to the U.S. dalliance with religious zealots, I was referring precisely to the so-called Mujahideen. You may go online and see pictures of Ronald Wilson Reagan, the U.S. president between 1980 and 1989, meeting with these forces, soon to be designated as, quote, terrorists, unquote, meeting with them in the Oval Office. Beards, turbans, and all. They were freedom fighters, we were told. But now, of course, as I said, the relations have soured, although keep your eye on these monies that the United States is holding that belong to Afghanistan that may be dangled to entice the Taliban into an anti-China alliance. Now, obviously, the events in Pakistan are a direct reflection of the fact that former Prime Minister Khan, in February 2022, was to be found in Moscow in a cozy chat with Vladimir Putin. This did not go down very well in Washington. Soon thereafter, he was driven from power. And what's happening to him now and what's happening to his party is a further extension of that, because once again, Pakistan was seen as a valued ally of U.S. imperialism for a good deal of the Cold War, because it was India and the Soviet Union in one corner, and Pakistan and Washington in the other corner. But now India is the fair-haired boy. It's being courted by all major powers, including Washington. And Pakistan has lost some of this value as a thorn in the side of India because of this U.S. attempt to cozy up to Prime Minister Modi in New Delhi. And so it seems that Prime Minister Khan, or former Prime Minister Khan, is going to be a sacrificial lamb, but obviously he's not willing to fade from the scene willingly.
Last article, Palestinians prisoners stage a mass hunger strike in Israeli jails. This is from Press TV. Your thoughts on that article?
Well, you know, I'm sure about what happened in that part of the world in the last few weeks, where the press reports were telling us that another Palestinian faction dubbed as so-called Islamic Jihad was crossing swords with the Israeli authorities and led to the deaths of a number of children. What's interesting is that we were told that Hamas, a powerful force in Gaza in particular, was sitting on the sidelines, we were told, as this conflict was emerging. But that was probably a bridge too far. Unfortunately, what's happening now is that Turkey, which had been an influential ally and comrade of the Palestinians, I'm sure you recall that time that you can find online where President Erdogan and one of the Israeli leaders almost came to blows on an international stage because Mr. Erdogan's objection to Israeli depredations in historic Palestine, which, of course, the Ottoman Turks have ruled for centuries. But now the Israelis and Turkey have just been made up, and it seems that the Palestinians are pushed further into a corner, which is not good news, because history tells us that when they're pushed into a corner, they don't necessarily lay down and go to sleep. They fight back with vigor.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.